we will begin here. All right, so today we're going to be talking about the mind-body problem. This is actually the first time I've assigned this chapter, and as I was rereading it, I just thought, why have I not assigned this before? It's so much fun. So I hope you're ready to have a good time. First, I'll introduce the mind-body problem, and then we'll look at two theories of mind: dualism and physicalism. These are the main contenders in philosophy of mind. So what are we talking about when we talk about the mind-body problem or minds in general? Well, we're all familiar with our bodies. You know them well, you've had it your whole life, right? And we're all familiar with our minds also. You maybe, arguably, we'll see arguments to the effect that you are actually more intimately familiar with your mind than your body. And it does seem on the surface that they're different, right? So for example, bodies have a size. I'm 5'5". I have blonde hair, blue eyes. My body has a shape. You can see it in my silhouette. A texture. If you feel my skin, now it's a little dry because it's getting into the colder months. My body has a color, which is not actually white, though it's characterized that way according to the social categories. It's actually a little peachy pink-ish. My body's also subject to the laws of physics. So they say in the chapter, if you throw a body out a window, any of you throw your body out a window of the second story window of a building, you'll crash to the ground, right? And a physicist could calculate the speed at which you would approach the ground, right? And the force with which you would hit the ground. So our bodies are subject to the laws of physics. And finally, they're public in the sense that you can all see it, right? You could see my body. Right now it's covered with clothes. A brain surgeon could actually open up my head and look at my brain too. It's also a part of my body. So not just the outside, but the inside is also public in that way, in that it's, in principle, it's observable by others. Some of the parts of our bodies we have to be cut open for others to be able to see them. Maybe you've had surgery before, so people have actually seen the inside of your body. But they're public in that sense. Minds seem wholly different, right? Minds include our thoughts, sensations, feelings, everything that happens in your mind, right? Everything that you feel, part of your consciousness, and not only your consciousness, but it seems like our minds also have an unconscious component too. Like you can, be in love with your best friend and not even know it until later on in your relationship or something, right? It seems like that's possible. And minds are private in the sense that no one else can see them. People can see your behaviors. They can infer from your behavior what you might be thinking or feeling. But then they're only seeing your body, right? They can't see your mind directly. Your mind is accessible only to you. Even a brain surgeon cannot see your thoughts. Okay, so one of the questions they ask us right at the outset of this chapter is to make a list. I guess it's a task, not a question, but make a list of features of the world that would disappear if minds were to suddenly vanish from the world. Right? If there were no minds, how would the world be different, right? Well, arguably, what do you think? Would there be color if there were no minds? I see some yeses and nos, which means it's a great question, right? We're just kind of prodding around to feel out our intuitions on some of these things. Would there be, how about time? Do you think there would be time if there were no minds? Talk to your neighbor for 1 minute. If there would be time if there were no minds. Okay, any conclusions? Anyone have strong feelings about it? Anyone think? I don't know. Couldn't possibly know. What do you think? Anyone want to take a stab? No time without minds? Yeah. Two people straight in a line from me.
Okay, I think time will still exist, but I don't think we have like the mental capacity to understand that, like what me and my partner was saying, like it's 6 o'clock on like a Tuesday night. I don't think we would be able to understand that, but it still exists.
Okay, time would exist, though the way people mark time wouldn't exist, you're saying. Okay, yeah.
I just said no because no one can perceive it.
No one can perceive it, so then it doesn't exist, you're saying.
We said nothing would exist.
Nothing would exist. Okay, so that's a form of idealism. Okay, we're going to skip over idealism. They introduce it in the chapter. They say idealism is the idea that minds are sort of the fundamental features of reality and everything else is contingent on minds. We talked about idealism when we talked about epistemology and knowledge, right? This idea that we can't really know anything outside of our minds, and that whether or not there's an external world or what it's like actually in itself, it's just a meaningless question because we can't ever escape our minds to assess that question. Okay, so that seems to be what you're defending. Okay, the reason this is presented is it's a food for thought, right? I encourage you to take a look at the food for thoughts or foods for thought, however you want to put that in the whole textbook, really. But a lot of these are really thought-provoking questions that get at some of the core issues of the topics that we're discussing. All right, so we know that minds and bodies are intimately connected. We know, for example, that, I thought I was going to be late because I had to go check out a book at the library. I just realized it was on my syllabus in another class, and so I was running from the library, right? I thought I was going to be late, and that sort of heightened my feelings, right? And I felt like the stress to make it to class on time. If you get a paper cut, right? It hurts. It causes a mental sensation of pain, right? The cut on your finger, the physical change in your body actually leads to a mental change. It leads to a state of pain. Feeling a crush can make you blush, right? It works the other way as well. Our minds can affect what our bodies are doing also. And you get you get scared. Maybe you whenever I have some kind of incident when I'm driving, right? If somebody cuts me off, or I have an encounter that's uncomfortably close to another car or something like that, my heart speeds up, my heart rate increases, and I get nervous, right? So changes in our bodies affect changes in our minds, and it works the other way too. Changes in our minds can also affect how our bodies are. Okay, so we know that. We know that they're intimately connected. The question is, how exactly are they related? That's the mind-body problem. Okay, how do we understand the connection between this kind of seemingly immaterial, non-extended, that just means it doesn't seem to take up any space, that is our mind, and this physical component of ourselves, our bodies, including our brains, but not just our brains, our whole bodies. How do we understand that relationship? Okay, we know they're causally related, but is there something deeper there? And how could they be causally related if they're so very different? Okay, so we're going to look at two answers in general. Dualism and physicalism. And we're going to look along the way at a lot of different types, a couple different types of dualism, a couple of different arguments for dualism and objections to dualism. And then we're going to look at 4 different types of physicalism. So it's going to get, there's a lot in this chapter, and we probably won't get through it all today, but we'll make it through one way or another. Okay? So here's the general idea. Dualism says that minds and bodies are ontologically independent, and physicalism says that minds are ontologically dependent on bodies. What the heck is ontological dependence? Well, you can think of it this way. This is the definition they give in the textbook. One entity is ontologically dependent on another entity if the first could not exist without the second. So they give some examples here, like heat ontologically depends on molecular motion. Okay? Heat just is the motion of molecules, right? If molecules are moving more rapidly and further apart, I think, then something is hotter, right? And as it gets colder, the molecules are slowing down, right? So heat and molecular motion, heat is ontologically dependent on molecular motion. That just means that heat couldn't exist without molecular motion, right? The molecules and the movement of the molecules is what heat consists in. Okay, so in one sense they're the same thing, but because the heat is actually contained in the motion of those molecules. But we say ontological dependence because the molecular motion seems to, in some sense, be more fundamental than the heat. Okay, another example is that a set of numbers depends ontologically on the numbers that comprise the set. All right, so if you take a set of numbers like 1, 2, 3 as a set, that ontologically depends on the numbers 1, 2, and 3 independently, right? It can taken independently. Okay, so they give other examples that are more controversial, like whether a person depends on their parents. Okay, so we say one entity is ontologically dependent on another entity if the first could not exist without the second. Well, we all know that you can exist even if your parents cease to exist, right? You could still be living. It doesn't mean you're going to go out of existence, but if we take the tense of it, if we sort of abstract away from present or past tense, the idea of children ontologically depending on their parents is that if there hadn't been the biological parents that you have, you wouldn't be you, right? If they hadn't existed, you wouldn't be the same person that you are. That's the idea. And maybe, it's controversial. Maybe specifically it's the specific egg and sperm that came together to create you. That's really what you're ontologically dependent on in this sense. But maybe if you weren't raised by biological parents, you might think that you're also ontologically dependent on whoever raised you, in the sense that if it hadn't been that particular person or those particular people, you wouldn't be the same person that you are. Okay, so something ontologically depends on another thing if the existence of the first thing or the existence of the second thing is required for the existence of the first thing. The first thing could not exist without the second thing. Okay, and this is, I'm moving quickly through this. My friend wrote a whole dissertation on ontological dependence, all right? So it's a hugely convoluted topic, and I had to go refresh my own memory of some of the intricacies of how we understand ontological dependence, but hopefully that will suffice as an introduction. So dualism is the view that the mind and body are ontologically independent. Okay, that they can be pulled apart. They're separate kinds of things. Their existence does not depend on one another. They're two distinct substances. And Descartes was a very famous dualist, right? He thought that our mind is who we are essentially, and our bodies are just kind of extraneous in that sense. That who we are really is our minds. Remember, his first bit of knowledge is I think, right? He thinks that what that means is that we are fundamentally thinking things, right? Thought is fundamentally what we're made of, and our bodies are kind of extrinsic to that. Okay, so a lot of arguments for dualism, this idea that the mind and body are separate things, depend on what's known as Leibniz's law. And Leibniz's law says that if two things, A and B, are identical to one another, then they have all the same properties. To understand what that means, you have to distinguish between numerical and qualitative identity. Okay, so I put numerically there. We're talking about identity in the sense of being one and the same thing, right? The way that Clark Kent and Superman are one and the same person. Okay, now there's another kind of identity we might have in mind when we say that two things are the same. Like if I say, hey, I have that shirt, right? A lot of you wear the same shirt because you're at the NC State store or whatever. I mean, your shirts are similar, not exactly the same, but suppose two people in the class have the same sweatshirt, right? It's just a red shirt with words NC State across the front in the same font, right? You might say they're wearing the same shirt, right? But of course we don't mean they're wearing one and the same shirt, right? Like they're both wearing a physically identical object, right? There's two shirts. There's actually two distinct shirts, even though they're alike. Okay, so numerical identity means they're actually one and the same object. The way that Superman and Clark Kent are the same, or Benjamin Franklin is the same person as the first postmaster general, right? This is an example that philosophers like to throw out there, right? They're one and the same person. There aren't two people, there's just one person. And we use different descriptions to talk about them. When we talk about the mind and body being identical, we're talking about numerical identity, right? And Leibniz's law is referring to numerical identity. Two things, the mind and the body, actually being one and the same object. They're not really two things. Even though we sense them differently, they're one and the same. That's the question, right? And that's what dualism denies. So dualism saying the mind and the body are not numerically identical. They're not one and the same thing. There's actually two separate things. Okay, so Leibniz's law says that if two things are actually numerically identical in the sense that there's not really two things, they're just one thing, they have to have all their features in common, right? It seems obvious, right? If we're just talking about one thing, then whatever features it has are the features it has. It doesn't matter how you describe it. Okay? How does dualism use Leibniz's law? How do dualists use Leibniz's law to argue for dualism? Well, they try to show that the mind and the body have different properties, and therefore that they aren't one and the same thing. Okay? Because, again, Leibniz's law says two things are identical. If A and B are actually numerically identical, one and the same thing, then they have to have all their properties in common. And so dualists say, well, the mind has some property and the brain or the body lacks that property, so therefore they aren't one and the same thing. Any questions so far? You with me? Okay. All right, so how do they do that specifically? Well, here's an argument that gets presented in the textbook. It's called the conceivability argument. It goes like this. Premise one, I can conceive that I exist without a body, but I cannot conceive that I exist without a mind. This comes from Descartes, okay? Descartes thought that the mind and the body are fundamentally different in this respect. We can imagine that we don't have a body, right? You can kind of close your eyes and imagine yourself like floating out into the Court of Carolinas over there. But you can't imagine yourself without a mind. At least that's what Descartes believed. Okay, so that's the first contentious point, I think. How many of you accept premises 1 and 2? I think, fair enough. All right, I can't really think of myself without a mind. What would that be even, right? It's not the same as like your dead body, right? We're not talking about your body without a mind. We're talking about you without a mind, right? And that seems different. And perhaps it's right that I can't really conceive of myself without a mind. I mean, that's what Descartes thought, right? That I think I am a thinking thing is so obviously true that it cannot be doubted, right? It can't be false if you believe it. Okay, so those are the first two premises. And I'm not thrilled with how this argument is set up because it's not following our rules for pulling apart all the premises and the conclusion, but it does show you that we have a line here because we're reaching in premise 3 a kind of sub-conclusion, right? A kind of intermediate conclusion in the middle of the argument for which the first two premises provide support, okay? So these two premises provide support. The first two premises are taken to provide support for premise 3, which is that my mind is more intimately connected to me than my body is. And thus, and again, now we have, the thus means that the second part of this sentence is in some way being shown to be true by the first part, which I think is another flaw with how this is set up in the textbook. We should pull those apart into two separate premises, but I just followed the author's notation here. So, thus my mind has a property, the property of being essentially connected to me that my body lacks. Okay, so again, we're using Leibniz's law, which says if two things are one and the same, then they have all the same properties. So now this argument is saying, well, these two things have different properties. My mind is really an essential part of who I am, and my body is not. Okay, I could have a transplant, right? A heart transplant, and I'd still be me, right? But I can't have a mind transplant, right? Then I'd be wherever my mind went, right? And somebody else would be in my body. That's at least seems like how most of us think about the relationship between our minds and bodies. At least it seems plausible that that's a plausible way to think about how you relate to your mind and your body. But then number 4, if this is Leibniz's law, right? If my mind has at least one different property than my body has, then my mind cannot be identical to my body. That's what Leibniz's law says. If they are identical, they have all the same properties. So if they have different properties, they must not be identical numerically. Okay, and therefore my mind is not identical to my body. Okay, so talk to your neighbor about whether you accept this argument, and if not, where you think it goes wrong.
I don't know about the first one. You're able to write yourself without a mind? Well, yeah. Think about just your conscience. If you close your eyes, if I'm being hurt, I'm still me. Are you though? Even if I'm in expert. Yeah, but your body will reflect them.
I get what you're saying.
It's like you're trying to say but not
No comment.
All right, anyone want to share where you're thinking about it, how you're thinking about it?
I mean, the formatting is a little rough, but for the most part, it feels pretty adequate to me. It's,
Okay.
I'm convinced.
You're sold. You're sold. All right. You're a duelist. Done. Anyone not convinced? Like to get some variety of perspective? Sydney?
For the first premise, I think they're like more talking about like having a soul or whatever, like when you die, that you like keep on going. I don't believe in that, so.
For the first premise, so do you think you can't even imagine that?
No. I'm like, I think once your brain like stops firing, like the signals in it, then you're like dead. That's what I think of. Like,
Yeah.
yeah.
So maybe you're right. But could it still also be true that we could imagine that we're wrong? That we could imagine an alternate reality where that's what happens?
Yeah, an alternate
Yeah.
reality.
Yeah, an alternate reality, right? So don't confuse thinking that it's just false, right, that you could exist without a body. With this claim, which is just saying you can imagine that you exist without a body. Anyone else?
The first premise, just like the way it's worded, I guess, like I can conceive that except them. But if you just imagine if you had like no body, so no eyes, no hands, or like
Yeah.
you were just mind. Your
Yeah.
mind is made up of what your body sees and feels. If you have absolutely no body, how do you?
Yeah, absolutely. That's something they mentioned in the textbook, right? Can we really conceive of that? So maybe just thinking, well, it's false. If you believe it's false that we can exist without our bodies, that's a different claim, right? But maybe you also think it's false that we can imagine ourselves without our bodies, because think about what your mind is, right? It's everything you're seeing with your eyes, feeling, it's the sensation you have of your clothes on your body, right? All these things are coming to you from your body. Yeah.
But isn't that because you've already had the experience of having a body? So if you never had a body in the first place, then how could you conceive that you exist? Like we can
I don't
only
know, are you
imagine-
challenging number one or
I'm challenging
defending
number
it?
one, yeah, I'm
Oh,
challenging
okay,
number
you're
one.
challenging it.
Yeah,
So
because we have a body now, like we've had one, so now we can perceive things, we can imagine things. But if we
Yeah.
never had a body, like if you were never born, then how could you conceive that you exist if you never had the experience of it?
So you're saying the only reason we can conceive that we exist without a body is because we have a body?
It's because at some point we've had a body and
Yeah.
we've had the experiences. So if you never had a body, you can never conceive that you exist.
Yeah. But what if there are minds that never had bodies? Is that, you think
I'm just saying, we can't know that, like.
Right, but,
Yeah.
okay. Do you want to respond to that? or-
Yeah, I feel like it's entirely possible that if in some way we could exist without bodies, like our whole schema, our whole framework, everything that we interpret is based off of the feedback that we get through our body. So if we were to exist as just a mind with no body, it's entirely possible that we could still have these kinds of thoughts, but based off of an entirely separate framework. As in, like, I'm trying to think of a way to, like, exemplify it, but nothing's really.
So you're defending number one?
Yeah, I think it is entirely possible to conceive a scenario in which you could exist as just a mind with no body.
Okay.
So like, if you don't have a body, then you never like really learn how to like speak a language, right? So like, I'm just thinking about, cause like your internal monologue is like English or whatever, right? So like, what would you, like you wouldn't be able to picture anything cause you haven't like seen anything if you've never had a body? Like, I don't know how that would work.
So maybe it's not possible to see without eyes, right? But is it, I mean, not possible for us to see without our eyes, right? But is it logically possible, right? Is it possible that there are beings who can see without eyes or think without language?
Yeah. But at some
It's
point,
controversial, yeah.
Well, at some point we all had to think without language. Like as a child, like when you come out of the womb, you don't know
Yeah.
anything. But I think you're thinking, like you know pain, but then that becomes down to
Okay.
like you have physical responses. So
Yeah. So we can pull apart thoughts and sensations also, right? So do you think infants can think or just sense?
I don't know.
Yeah, it's a question. And when we talk about animals too, there's a lot of literature about whether dogs can have cognition, right? Because they don't have language, so can they think? In famous papers, someone argues, well, the dog, you think like the dog's chasing a squirrel, right? And then the squirrel runs up a tree, and the dog stands at the bottom of the tree barking up the tree. You think, well, the dog thinks the squirrel's up the tree, right? Even when the squirrel disappears and the dog's still standing there barking. But it's been argued that if the dog doesn't have a language, then there's no way to represent squirrels in its mind. And so our perception of that scenario, that the dog is thinking the squirrel's up the tree, is just a misunderstanding of what's actually happening in the dog's mind. All controversial topics. All right, so they're going to attack this conceivability argument from a different direction. And the direction is this. They're going to say, look, Leibniz's law does not apply to properties that involve the way we conceive of objects. Okay, so how we conceive of something is not really a property of the object itself. It's a property of how we're thinking about the object. So here's an argument that shows that Leibniz's law just doesn't apply in this case, because this is not about the object itself, it's about our perception of the object. Okay, so premise one, I can conceive that Clark Kent is an ordinary human being, but premise two, I can't conceive that Superman is an ordinary human being, right? Because we have different conceptions of who Clark Kent is and who Superman is, and maybe at some point you didn't even know that they were the same, like you're reading the graphic novel and you're reading comic strip and it hasn't been revealed yet that they're the same to you. So you're thinking they're two completely different people, right? Superman wears a cape and Clark Kent wears glasses, and just they're not the same, right? You think of them in very different terms, and yet they're one and the same. Okay, so this argument is an objection to the conceivability argument, because it's saying just because we think of something in two different ways does not mean that they're not one and the same thing. Okay, so it's the claim here is essentially that Leibniz's law is a wrong-headed way to think about properties involving how we conceive of the objects. Okay, and another example they give, put this right here. Yeah, okay, another example they give is the morning star and the evening star. Okay, so the brightest star visible in the evening sky is Venus. The brightest star visible in the morning sky, also Venus, right? It was a discovery that those were actually the same object, right? One is associated with being visible at night, and one is associated with being visible in the morning, and you can imagine people who think they're not the same, right? One is visible at night and not in the morning, and the other is visible in the morning and not at night. They have different properties, right? But it was just unbeknownst to them that they actually are one and the same thing, right? So just because we conceive of something in two different ways does not mean that both those ways of conceiving of it aren't about the same singular object. Okay, so that's the objection to this argument for dualism. It's saying the conceivability argument says I can conceive of myself without a body, but I can't conceive of myself without a mind, therefore they're distinct. And this response to that argument is saying just because we conceive of two things differently does not mean that they aren't actually one and the same thing. Explain that to your neighbor. This response to the objection. The response to the conceivability argument.
The morning star, evening star, yes, but we're seeing it differently, but it's the same star. It's the same moon.
What questions do you have? Should we move on?
Can you restate it again?
Yeah, okay, so we're looking at an argument for dualism. And the argument for dualism is the view that the mind and body are actually independent substances. So the argument for that says we can conceive of ourselves without a body, but we can't conceive of ourselves without a mind. They have two different properties. Our body has the property of not being conceivable, or being conceivable without our, how would I put that? Our body, the property that the body has is my being able to conceive of myself without it. Right, that's a lot to state. Our mind doesn't have that property, right? Our mind, I can't conceive of myself without. Okay, so I have this kind of different, more intimate relationship with my mind, according to this argument. So they say, my mind has a different property than my body, being more intimately connected to me, and my body being less intimately connected to me, right? Those are two different properties. And because they have two different properties, if Leibniz's law is correct, now you have to remember modus tollens here, right? That's why our argument structures are important, because Leibniz's law is saying, if they're the same, they have all the same properties. And this argument is saying they don't have all the same properties, therefore they're not identical, they're not the same. That's a form of modus tollens. Okay, so the response to this argument is saying, just because we conceive of something in two different ways does not mean they're not one and the same object. And the examples are Superman and Clark Kent. We have totally different conceptions of who they are. But if they're one and the same person, then that person both wears a cape sometimes and wears glasses sometimes, right? Okay, so it does have all the same properties, right? But just because we conceive of them differently does not mean that they're distinct, does not mean that they're ontologically independent. Does that help? Any other questions? All right. Okay, so here's another route they take that doesn't involve how we conceive of these two things, all right? They're still using Leibniz's law. Again, Leibniz's law says if A and B are identical numerically, they have all the same properties. We saw that conceivability is not an appropriate application of Leibniz's law. That's the claim, right? Because in some cases, two things are the same, but we conceive of them differently. So they have different properties in that way of describing them, but it's not really a property of the object. of themselves. It's a property of how we're thinking about them. So this argument is trying to avoid that response, right? This argument is trying to establish that the mind and body are independent, that they're not identical, by showing that they have two distinct properties and not appealing to how we conceive of them. And the property of mind here is intentionality. Intentionality means being about something. Okay, so for example, right, you are looking at a tree. I've had this illustration up here before. Right? So you're looking at that tree and you're thinking about the tree as you're looking at it. You can practice this right now, right? Many trees to take a look at out the window. Your thought is about the tree. That's what intentionality is, right? Your thought is about the tree, right? Our thoughts have content. They have things that they're about, right? You can right now think of your bed, right? Close your eyes, you can picture it. Assuming you have a bed, right? Your thought that I just prompted in you is about your bed, right? Is about that object that's in your room or in your apartment or wherever you live, dorm room, right? So there's an object there, and your thought has a really special relationship to it, and that relationship is intentionality, right? Your thought is about that object, that physical object in your room, okay? Brains, bodies, they don't seem to have that property of being about other things. Right? It'd be weird to say your brain or your brain state, right? The physical state of your brain right now, like some neuron firing in your brain, is about your bed. Right? But it's not weird at all to say your thought is about your bed. Now, the author goes on to say physical objects don't seem to have intentionality, but a lot of physical objects do have intentionality, like a painting, right? A painting can be a representation of something else in the world. You can paint a picture of yourself, right? And then that painting, in that sense, has a kind of intentionality about you, right? It's about you. Or you can, a word, right? Everyone got the word of the day here? All right, a word, like a phrase. Here's my name, right? Amy Glazer. The word. Now the word here is really just a pattern of ink from this marker. Right? It's just a physical thing. It's just an ink set up in a particular pattern on the board, right? It's just some ink splashed on the board in a particular way, right? Well, that is about me too. So some physical objects do have intentionality, but our brains don't seem to have that feature. Our bodies don't seem to have that feature, right? Of being about something else. So again, this argument is trying to establish, using Leibniz's law, that because the mind and the brain have different properties, they're not one and the same thing. Questions? Is everyone a dualist now? Responses? Or we can just keep moving. Okay, well, I trust that you will slow me down if I'm moving too quickly. Keep in mind that when an argument fails to establish its conclusion, it doesn't show that that conclusion is false. Right? So even if you don't buy into any of these arguments, dualism still may be correct. It may just be that we haven't hit on a good argument for it. Right? Or maybe you're convinced by these arguments, in which case you're convinced that dualism is true. I don't know where you're all at. Probably you're just trying to understand it and take it in and figure out what's being said, much less develop a response to it, which is a fine place to be. All right? So just because we may not buy into these arguments does not show that the conclusion they're trying to establish is false. It could just be that it's not a good argument for it. There are lots of bad arguments for true conclusions. That's a really important take-home message from this class. Okay, so what are some problems for dualism? Okay, so just showing that an argument is a bad argument does not show that dualism is false, but these problems that are raised in the textbook for dualism are taking that further step of saying it's not just that these are bad arguments, it's actually that the conclusion they're trying to establish is false. And here's some reasons why. The first one is a problem of interaction. That's what they call it in the textbook. And the problem of interaction says, if the mind is this mysterious, immaterial, non-physical substance, and bodies are physical objects, then how is it they could ever causally interact? But like I said at the beginning of this lecture, they do seem to causally interact all the time, right? Like I have a thought like, I'm going to raise my arm. I shall raise my arm, right? And then I raise my arm, I'm moving my body with my mind. Now this may remind you of libertarianism because I use the same example, right? Libertarianism, you may think it's kind of a form of dualism in a sense, thinking that there's some immaterial aspect of who we are that stands apart from the laws of physics that can still intervene in the physical world. Okay, so the problem of interaction says, if they were really two distinct substances, how would they be able to interact? And this problem, the ghost in the machine is a standard kind of image we give, right? Of our minds somehow manipulating, moving our bodies around, right? So again, when we might feel feelings of falling in love, right? And then you start to blush, right? Or you feel a crush, so you start to blush. This is one way that our mind can influence our body. Or you get a paper cut and you feel pain, right? So the physical process, the physical cut on your finger leads to that mental state being the feeling of pain, right? So if they're really distinct substances, and our minds are physical and our bodies are physical and our minds are not, the problem of interaction says, how could it be that they interact? But we know they interact. So it must not be that they're as different as the dualist thinks they are. Okay, it's an argument against dualism. How can an immaterial substance influence a physical substance? And they point out this would violate the principle of the conservation of energy, right? So if some immaterial substance causes some physical object to move, the physical object is using energy to move, but the non-physical object didn't have energy to pass off to the physical object, right? So how is it that they interact? The problem says actually dualism is just a bad theory because they can't interact. It violates a basic law of physics. Any questions about this objection, the problem of interaction? Right? And again, a ghost in a machine is a good image because you think of a ghost as this immaterial, mysterious, like not even smoke. It's just like, right? No physical existence, right? Occupying a machine. How could the ghost like move the levers of the machine if it doesn't have a physical body to push the levers with? Okay, that's the idea. Okay, so Gilbert Ryle raised a different objection to dualism, and that is that he thinks dualism is making a category mistake. On page 138 and 139, they give the example of a category mistake from Ryle. And the example is your parents come to visit you in college, and they say, we're so excited to see the university. Show us all around. And so you take them around, and you say, here's my philosophy class. I hope you'll bring your parents here when they visit, right? And you say, here's like my philosophy class's building. Here's my dorm room, and here's my roommate, and here's the building where my major is housed, and here's the cafeteria where I get my food. And here's the tour of Carolinas, my favorite place to sit on campus. And they say, at the end of the tour, was a great tour of your philosophy class and the building where your major is housed in the Court of Carolinas and your dorm room and your roommate and all that stuff. But where's the university? I haven't seen it yet. That's a category mistake, because you're thinking that the university is something over and above or separate from all the physical things that make up the university, right? But the university is not a different kind of thing than all the things that you just showed your parents. Okay, so Gilbert Ryle is saying dualism makes the same kind of mistake. It's thinking that once we account for all the physical parts of you, there's still something over and above that counts as your mind. But actually your mind is just all those physical components, right? You're thinking they're in different categories. Like the university is something wholly different from all the pieces of the university, but they're not. They're one and the same thing. And so your mind is like that, and people who think they're different are just making a category mistake. Okay, questions about dualism. Tell your neighbor whether you're convinced or not. And by the way, the first, before you do that, the first argument for dualism that they start out with is people having out-of-body experiences, right? Or near-death experiences. And they give a lot of examples of those, even from famous philosophers who've been atheists their whole life, right? Who might have this experience and then totally changes their view of the connection between mind and body, right? So they say, look, people describe very similar near-death experiences as if their mind is floating above and they can look back and see their body lying in a hospital table or wherever. Dualism is the best way to explain those experiences. Okay, we didn't get into that because I think the other stuff is more interesting and complicated. I wanted to take more time to explain it, but you can read the stuff about near-body experiences also for yourself. So maybe your religious views or your views about people's testimonies of having near-death experiences, or maybe some of you have had some kind of experience in which you felt your body and your mind separating. Okay, so now what do you think of dualism? Are you convinced or not? Talk to your neighbor and wake up your neighbor if you need to. Just a little tap on the shoulder, don't be afraid. All right, anyone? I'll give you one. What do you think? You're not convinced? Fair. How many of you all are convinced? 1, 2, 3, 4.5. How many of you are not convinced? About the same. I guess for the rest of you, just taking it all in, not sure.
Need to learn more.
Need to learn more. Great position to have about many of these things. All right. Okay, so let's look at the physicalists, right? The physicalists think dualism, that's just ridiculous, right? We can explain everything we need to in terms of the physical stuff. You shouldn't be on your phone, all right? We can explain everything there is to know about minds in terms of physical states of the body. That's the physicalist idea. Or put differently, minds are ontologically dependent on bodies. The most commonly thought to be our brains, right? Our minds depend on our brains in some way. Okay, remember, ontological dependence isn't just causal dependence. It doesn't just mean that our bodies cause what's happening in our minds. It's closer than that, more closely connected, the way a set of numbers is dependent on the numbers that make it up. Right? In some sense, it's actually the same stuff. Okay, so that's what the physicalist thinks. is that our minds are in some way contained within our bodies. They're one and the same thing. And to look more deeply at physicalism, we're going to learn about 4 different forms of physicalism, right? 4 different physicalist theories, and these are outlined on page 140. They are behaviorism, identity theory, functionalism, and eliminative materialism. These are 4 different ways that physicalists characterize the connection, the relationship between minds and bodies. So let's start with behaviorism. So behaviorism has its roots in the development of psychology, okay? And we can start with, well, there's 2 kinds of behaviorism. So things are getting even more complicated, and they're going to get more complicated from here on out, just so you're prepared, right? So methodological behaviorism was appealing to psychologists because psychologists wanted to understand, to study minds, but there's no way to really verify what's happening in someone's mind, right? You can't just look at someone and decide how they're feeling, right? And even appealing to their testimony, so they give the example of whether it's more painful to have your navel pierced or your ear pierced. Anyone have both pierced? No. Anyone have 2 different body parts pierced? No. Nobody. All right. So the idea is people misinterpret their own sensations, right? If you just ask people which is more painful, you might get a variety of responses. You might even get different responses from the same person depending on when you ask them. Like if you ask them right after they pierce their navel and their ear piercing is somewhere further in the past, right? They might just not remember as accurately or not be able to self-report accurately which pain was greater, right? So we can't really verify the nature of people's minds directly, right? But psychologists still want to study that aspect of people, and so they said, well, the best way to learn about people's minds is to study their behavior, right? So that's where we get a lot of psychological theories, right? Like Freud, he didn't think that little boys want to sleep with their mothers, that's Oedipus complex, right? He didn't think that if you ask little children if they want to have sex with their mothers, they'll say yes, right? He thought you can confirm this based on how they behave in certain circumstances. You can learn about what they're really feeling, right? Just like we said, presumably we have unconscious aspects of our minds, right, that aren't directly accessible to us, but that still might influence our behaviors, right? Like when you blow up at someone and you didn't even realize you were that mad before you just like blow up at someone, right? And then you realize like all the stress you've been dealing with that you haven't really had taken the time to feel out, right? So instead of trying to study people's minds directly, which is impossible, or even through their first person reporting about what's going on in their minds, a more reliable way to understand people's minds is to study their behaviors. Okay, this is part of the development of psychology. That's methodological behaviorism, the idea that we can learn about minds by studying behavior. Okay, but there's a deeper kind of behaviorism called logical behaviorism. And this is a much more contentious claim and more widely thought to be false, frankly, that actually everything that we can say about minds, we could say in terms of behavior. Okay, so we can translate claims about our minds into claims about our behavior. So, example, John loves Lucas can be translated as, it means the same thing as, John has a tendency to bring flowers and say I love you and hug Lucas repeatedly, etc. Right? The behaviors that we embody when we're in love are what being in love consists in. That's what it is to be in love, is to act like you're in love, is to display behaviors of someone who's in love. right? Okay, so it's a really deep connection. It's saying they're actually mean the same thing. Claims about people's minds and claims about people's behaviors. That we can understand, that is, we can translate claims about how people feel and think, what they're thinking, what's going on in their minds, their mental life. We can translate that. It means the same thing as certain claims about their behaviors. Okay? A really obvious objection comes immediately to the forefront is, what about actors? Right? Actors, people can act like they're in love without being in love. And not just professional actors, but like people who are faking being in love, right? Because they're scared to leave a relationship or something. They might still act. They might still give Lucas flowers and say, I love you, and hug him repeatedly. But they're not actually in love. That seems possible, right? So if they mean the same thing, then that wouldn't be possible. Questions about behaviorism? Am I moving too quickly? Okay. All right, so another physicalist theory of mind is identity theory, which is, on the face of it, a lot more plausible than behaviorism. There aren't many behaviorists these days. Okay, not many people believe in behaviorism, but identity theory seems more reasonable. Identity theory just says mental states are identical with brain states. Mental states just are brain states. The feeling of being in pain is identical to some state of your brain, or being tired, right? There's some state of your brain. We can, neuroscientists study this, right? They look to see what happens when we put, fire neurons here in the brain, or what happens when this part of your brain gets damaged by a stroke and then you're unable to think, right? Or speak. You lose your language capacity because a certain part of your brain gets damaged in an injury, right? All of this is support for the view that mental states are just states of your brain. Okay, so for example, this is just fake. This is just made up state of your brain, right? Let's suppose that there's some state of your brain that's your C fibers firing, right? Some aspect of your brain, neurological event, C fibers firing. That's what it is to be in pain. Okay? And like I said, it's supported by neuroscience. We can look at, make people feel a certain way, and the same parts of their brains light up. You scan their brains with in an MRI, right? Look at their brain activity, and then you see when you're, shown violent images, this part of your brain lights up because you feel, this feeling in response to viewing violent images. But when you're shown images of children, another part of your brain lights up, right? Because we have these feelings about children that we don't have about violence, right? So the idea is there's a one-on-one correspondence. Every feeling you have, every event that happens in your mind corresponds and is in fact identical with some event that happens in your brain, some physical event in your brain. What do you think? Plausible? More people seem friendly to that idea? Okay, so what are some of the problems? Well, one of the problems has been labeled chauvinism. And this is the idea. Chauvinism is when you think something like you're better than something else, right? Chauvinism in this case means that we kind of favor brains that are constituted like our brains, right? We say if pain equals your C fibers firing, then only those beings who have brains like ours, who have C fibers, can experience pain. But that seems wrong, at least on the surface, right? It seems like aliens could in principle have minds, could in principle experience pain, but might have physical hardware that's totally different from the physical hardware that we have in our heads. Okay, so the identity theory seems to almost to tie mental states too closely to particular states of your brain, saying that the only way you can have pain, like if pain is identical to C fibers firing, then the only way anything can be in pain is to be in that brain state, right? Because that's what it is to be in pain. But that just doesn't seem right. And they give the examples not only of aliens. Oh, thought there's I think the slide that I'm looking for right there is going to show up somewhere later. All right, aliens, octopuses. They say, right, octopuses. Does anyone know? Do octopuses have brains? I think their whole body is capable of sensation and thinking, right? So they don't have brains, right? But presumably they can feel pain. At least it's possible, right? But they don't have brains that are anything like ours. They don't have anything like our brains, right? So if pain is just C fibers firing, whatever brain state in humans corresponds to being in pain, then no other creature with a wholly different constitution could experience pain. Okay? Or aliens, or they say, imagine this. Imagine that you have a stroke, part of your brain gets damaged, and medicine has advanced so that they're able to replace that part of your brain with some kind of silicon chip. Right? So they put just a piece of artificial brain stuff in your brain to allow your brain to make those connections again. And then your thinking is restored, right? Maybe it's not actually possible given where technology is, but it seems logically possible, right? It seems like we can imagine that medicine and technology have advanced to that level where we're able, just like you could get an artificial hip, to plug in some artificial component to make your brain work better. Right? Well, then it seems like, well, can't we just replace, in principle, couldn't we just replace each part, like a little bit at a time, and your brain would still function, but in the end it'd be totally made of plastic, right? Well, maybe it's not actually possible, at least not with the state of our current technology, but would that be possible in the future? And now maybe that's bringing you back to think about whether robots can think, right? Because some of you were dead set against that, and some of you might think, well, possible, or maybe you just don't know, right? But maybe this example helps convince you that you don't have to have a mind made of what human brains are made of, right? You don't have to have a brain made of what human brains are made of in order to have a mind. Okay? And that's the accusation of chauvinism, is that identity theory mistakenly claims that in order to have a mental state, you have to have a brain just like ours, right? That whatever state is in whatever state our brain is in when we experience that mental state. Take a minute just to think about that. I'm throwing a lot at you today. There's a lot to get through. We already missed a day of talking about chapter 6. Okay, so is that a long enough minute? Now all your minds are really busy, right? So presumably your brains are really busy too. We could probably look at them and with some technology show a picture, put a picture up here on the screen of somebody's brain thinking through these questions. We see different parts of the brain actually being active now while you're thinking about what I'm saying. Any questions? So let's see if we can do better than identity theory, right? Because how many of you think octopuses can have mental activity, right? Can have sensations at least, feel pain, perhaps, right? I saw a story about an octopus that escaped from a lab through a storm drain, right? Through like a drain in the building and then went out back into the ocean, right? So if that's not like evidence of some kind of mental activity, right? It seems like it is. Okay, so all right, so functionalism tries to solve this problem of chauvinism. I'm just going to introduce functionalism and then take questions, and then we'll call it a day, and we'll continue on our next class. All right. So some concepts point to specific substances, right? Like the term water. We talked about that a little bit. Water points to this stuff also known as H2O, right? That's what it is to be water. is to be that stuff, something with that chemical constitution. Just like gold, right? Gold is an element. It points to a particular kind of stuff. If you're not that stuff, then you're not gold. Okay? If something isn't comprised of that molecular structure, then it's not gold. Right? Other concepts are functional concepts. A functional concept is a concept that is about not a particular kind of substance, but anything that fulfills a particular function. So they give the example of money in the textbook. Anything can count as money, right? We could even have a whole currency just for our class, right? Where we get like I ask everyone to bring 5 socks, right? And then everyone brings some snacks, right? And then you can use your socks to buy people snacks, right? And if you get more socks, right, then you can get even more snacks or prizes or something. We can have our own imagined currency, right? To act as money within our classroom. There are cities that have their own currency in this country. Okay, so, or we could use, we have like electronic money, right? Like how much I have in my Venmo account. I have money in my Venmo account, right? But it's not dollar bills, right? It's all just computerized, imaginary money, right? So in some sense, all right? So a lot of different things can count as money, not to mention like different money from different countries, like dollars versus pesos or other kinds of money, all right? So money, the term as a concept, refers to anything that fills a particular role. It doesn't have to be made of paper like our money does, like our dollar bills are. Okay, mousetrap is another example. So a mousetrap is anything that turns a free mouse into a trapped one. Could be an upside down trash can, right? Could be one of those that's gonna end the mouse's life. Could be the kind of trap that I used when my duplex neighbor, who was a hoarder, moved out, and I had 16 mice in my apartment. Just have a heart trap, that's what it's called, where it traps them, keeps them in a little box, and then you can deliver them to your least favorite other neighbor or to the nearby forest, which is what I chose. All right, so that's a mousetrap too, right? All of these different forms of mousetraps exist, right? And they're all mousetraps, right? But they're not at all made of the same substance. They're not even structured the same way. Okay, so mousetrap is a functional concept. Money is a functional concept. Other kinds of concepts are substance concepts like water and gold. Okay, they point to the actual stuff, not to a particular function. Functionalism says that brain states are functional states. They're mental concepts like pain or joy or anger or excitement, are functional concepts. That anything that plays that role, a certain functional role, which is to take certain inputs and then provide certain outputs. Right? So like pain takes inputs like abrasions to your skin, right? Or knocking into stuff, right? Or whatever causes pain, the types of physical events that cause pain, and as outputs gives like squealing, screeching, screaming, right? If it's heavy enough, or what's it called? Grimacing, right? A grimace, right? So pain is something that takes certain physical events as inputs, like cutting your finger, and it gives certain outputs, like a grimace, right? Or a cry out. But that can be realized by lots of different types of brain hardware, right? So we can say that if an animal, right, if you cut off an octopus's leg and it screeches, right, or screams the way that people scream, I mean, like, how do we know? It wasn't thought that animals feel pain at all, right? But then they said, well, look, like if you dissect a live cow, right, then it's gonna it's gonna like screech and respond in the ways that people respond when they're in pain, right? That's every reason we have to believe that they're experiencing pain too. Sorry if that was too gruesome for some of you. I used to take my students to a slaughterhouse, that's why I thought of that when we studied ethics. Okay, but then I couldn't do it anymore. All right. Relieved. All right, so I'll leave you with that. Well, imagine some children like frolicking through a big meadow, right? So I'll leave you with that. And we'll pick up after, I believe there's a quiz. I believe there's a quiz on Monday, so that will only address what we've already talked about. Okay? Let me confirm that.